For centuries, Europeans had a simple and rather elegant trick for surviving a hot summer's day. As the evening fell and the air outside finally began to cool, they would throw open their shutters and their windows and let the cool night air come flooding in to fill their homes. And then, in the morning, they would close everything up tight again, sealing that precious coolness inside, held behind thick stone walls to carry them through the worst heat of the day. It worked beautifully for generation after generation. But now, across much of Europe, that ancient trick is quietly failing, because the nights themselves have stopped cooling down, and an entire continent that was, quite literally, built for a cooler world is slowly discovering that it can no longer cool itself the way that it always has. This is the story of how Europe is being forced to completely reinvent the way that it lives. Before we go any further, if this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, take just 1 second to subscribe. A lot of folks watch these all the way to the end and simply forget to, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Alright, let's begin. To really understand what is happening here, you first have to understand a simple but profound fact. Europe was built for a cool world. Its climate, for most of modern history, was a mild and a temperate one, gentle summers and reliably cool nights. And so everything about the place was quietly designed around that assumption. The buildings, in particular, were made to trap heat and to hold on to it in order to survive long, cold winters, not to shed it or to keep it out. Air conditioning was almost unheard of and often looked upon as wasteful and unnecessary. Even the daily rhythms of life and the great summer holidays all rested on the comfortable assumption that a truly dangerous heat was a rare and a fleeting visitor. But that entire assumption is now breaking down. As one major climate body recently, and rather strikingly put it, European society is now waking up to the fact that it was built for a climate that no longer exists. With the continent now sitting around 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the industrial age, and warming faster than anywhere else on the entire planet, those old, comfortable assumptions are simply collapsing. The heat is no longer a rare visitor at all. It is fast becoming a permanent and a defining feature of European life. And so everything that was once designed around the old, cooler climate, the homes, the cities, the daily habits, the holidays themselves, now has to change. And nowhere is this shift more startling than in the way the heat is now reaching deep into the traditionally cool north of the continent, places that once felt almost immune to it. In recent summers, the United Kingdom has smashed its all-time record for May, beating the previous mark by a full 2 degrees. France has recorded its hottest ever start to the summer, with an early heat wave forcing authorities to close 200 schools across the country, and even shutting parts of the Eiffel Tower itself to protect visitors from the punishing heat. Cities from Paris to London have had to cancel outdoor events, open emergency cooling stations, and warn their populations to stay indoors. These are not the sun-baked cities of the deep south. These are the cool, gray, temperate capitals of northern and western Europe, places that were built quite emphatically for rain and for chill, and that are now being caught again and again, utterly unprepared by a heat they were never designed to face. And it all starts with that failing shutter trick, because it captures the whole problem so perfectly. That old, elegant method only actually works if the night genuinely gets cool. But more and more, across Europe, it simply doesn't anymore. Increasingly, Europeans are being forced to endure what climatologists call tropical nights. Nights in which the temperature never once drops below a stifling 20 degrees Celsius, offering no relief at all, and no chance to flush the built-up heat out of a home or out of an exhausted human body. Experts now state it very plainly. Europe has reached a limit to this kind of natural, traditional adaptation. The single oldest and the simplest defense that people ever had against the summer heat, the reliable cool of the night, is quietly and steadily being taken away from them. And when the night no longer cools, a home that was carefully built to trap and hold its temperature suddenly becomes a trap of an entirely different kind, a slow oven, holding all of the day's heat right through until the morning. And I'm genuinely curious as we go, where you live, does the night still cool things down in summer? Or has that started to change? Let me know down in the comments. I read them all, and honestly, they often decide what I dig into next. So the obvious answer, you might very reasonably think, is a simple one. Just install air conditioning, exactly like the rest of the hot world already does. And indeed, that is precisely what is now beginning to happen, all across the continent. But here is where Europe runs headlong into one of its most genuinely difficult and most bitterly contentious dilemmas. Because air conditioning, for Europe, turns out to be a deeply and surprisingly complicated bargain. First, consider the sheer scale of the gap that has to be closed. Only about 1 in 5 European households currently has any air conditioning at all. Now compare that figure to a country like the United States, or Japan, or South Korea, where well over 90% of all homes are air-conditioned. For almost the entirety of its history, Europe simply never needed the technology, and it's environmentally conscious. Energy-conscious culture often actively resisted it, viewing it as wasteful and even a little indulgent. So Europe is starting this race from very nearly a standing stop. And there is a genuinely powerful and a completely valid case to be made for a great deal more of it. Because as these heat waves have turned deadly, air conditioning is now increasingly seen not as a mere luxury, but as a genuine, life-saving piece of climate adaptation. In a hospital, in a nursing home, in a school, in any place at all that is filled with the elderly, the sick, and the most vulnerable, reliable cooling during a severe heat wave can quite literally be the difference between life and death. And almost no expert seriously disputes that Europe now urgently needs a great deal more cooling in exactly these kinds of critical places. Quick one before we continue. If someone in your family or a friend would find this genuinely interesting, please do send it their way. That word of mouth is honestly how a channel like this one grows. And if it's been worth your time so far, a quick like really does help the next person find it too. But here, now, is the great catch, and it is a very real one. Air conditioning is in a very fundamental sense a trap, because an air conditioner does not actually destroy heat at all. It merely moves it. It pulls the unwanted heat out of your room, and then it dumps that heat straight out into the street outside. So when a whole city switches on all of its air conditioners at once, every single one of those machines is busy pumping its collective waste heat out into the shared outdoor air, actively making the city's streets, and everyone still walking around in them, even hotter than before. The cooling of the fortunate few can quite directly worsen the heat for the struggling many. And that is only the very first of the problems. Because all of those air conditioners, running at once, also draw an absolutely enormous amount of electricity, all at the very same time, on the very hottest days of the year, spiking the demand on the power grid so sharply that it can overload the entire system and cause it to crash. Which brings on exactly the kind of widespread blackout that turns most deadly during the peak of a heat wave. And on top of all of that, unless the electricity itself is coming from clean sources, then burning yet more fuel to run yet more air conditioners simply pumps out more of the very emissions that are heating up the whole planet in the first place. It becomes a genuinely vicious circle. The rising heat drives the demand for more cooling, and the cooling, in turn, drives yet more heat. And then there is the simple and rather troubling matter of basic fairness. Because air conditioning is only ever an option for those who can actually afford it, who can afford to buy the unit in the first place, and then to pay the soaring electricity bills required to run it through a long, hot summer, which threatens to crack open a stark new divide, running right down the middle of society. The comfortable, cooled, and safe homes of the well-off on the one side, and the sweltering, dangerous, and overheated homes of everyone else on the other. A brand new climate divide, sorted entirely by wealth. So, if simply air conditioning the entire continent is such a trap, then what on earth is the actual answer? And this is where the story becomes genuinely and rather wonderfully interesting, because the very smartest thinking on the problem is not about fighting the heat with brute mechanical force at all. It is about cleverly designing the heat away. It is a two-part approach, and the first part of it is quite simply a rediscovery of some very old wisdom. Because for thousands of years, the hot parts of the world, very much including southern Europe itself, knew perfectly well how to keep cool without a single machine. Thick, heavy walls that soak up the heat slowly and release it gently. Shutters and deep shade to block the fierce sun before it ever gets inside. Narrow, winding alleyways and shaded inner courtyards that trap and hold pools of cooler air. Light-colored, whitewashed surfaces that reflect the sunlight away instead of drinking it in. And of course, that most civilized institution of all, the siesta, the simple, sensible practice of not being out and about during the most dangerous, blistering heat of the afternoon. And here lies a delicious irony. It is the cooler north of Europe that never learned any of these tricks, precisely because it never once had to, and so it is now the north that finds itself having to learn them the fastest of all. And modern science is now taking these ancient ideas and supercharging them. All across Europe, cities are busy planting trees, which cool the surrounding air both through their shade and through the moisture they quietly release. They are installing green roofs, covered over in living plants, and painting their roofs and their pavements in reflective, heat-bouncing white. Buildings are being designed, and older ones retrofitted, with clever automatic shading, and with night ventilation systems that intelligently flush cool air through the structure whenever it happens to be available. And the potential of all this is genuinely enormous. One study found that simply combining smart window shading with good night ventilation could slash a building's entire need for cooling by an astonishing 84%, even under the hotter climate expected by the middle of this century. Some places are even beginning to write this thinking directly into law. The City of London, for one, now operates what it calls a cooling hierarchy, which actually requires new buildings to first exhaust all of these passive, natural cooling measures before they are ever permitted to fall back on energy-hungry air conditioning at all. But adapting Europe's buildings is far easier said than done, and it runs into a very particular and very European obstacle, history itself, because so much of Europe is old. Its cities are filled with centuries-old buildings, protected apartment blocks, and entire historic districts that are legally shielded to preserve their architectural heritage. And you cannot simply bolt modern cooling systems or slap reflective coatings and external shades onto a protected 17th century facade. Retrofitting these beautiful old buildings to cope with the new heat is frequently extremely expensive, technically difficult, and tangled up in strict planning rules designed to keep them looking exactly as they always have. It is one thing to design a cool new building from scratch. It is a far harder thing to reinvent a city that was largely finished being built long before anyone ever imagined summers like these. And so the expert consensus that is now steadily emerging is a sensible and a rather elegant marriage of the two approaches. First, use clever passive design to dramatically slash the sheer amount of cooling that a building needs in the first place. And then, for those truly extreme heat waves when even that is not quite enough, use highly efficient air conditioning, powered wherever possible by clean energy like solar, to cover the remaining gap, and concentrate it, above all, exactly where it matters the very most, in the hospitals, the care homes, and the schools. Done properly. This combined approach could dramatically cut how much air conditioning the world needs at all, saving trillions of dollars in costs, and vast quantities of planet heating emissions in the process. But perhaps the single most fascinating sign of this entire new reality is the way that it is beginning to reshape not merely Europe's buildings, but its whole way of life, and even, quite remarkably, its very map of where people go and what they choose to do there. Take, for a start, the sacred European summer holiday. For generations upon generations, the European summer meant one thing, and one thing only: heading south. Down to the sun-drenched golden beaches of Spain, and Italy, and Greece, and Croatia. But now, the very height of summer in exactly those places is becoming genuinely, and often dangerously, far too hot for a great many travelers to actually enjoy. And so a remarkable new trend has quietly emerged, and it has arrived with a rather charming name of its own: the Coolcation. Instead of roasting on a sweltering Mediterranean beach in the middle of August, growing numbers of tourists are now choosing, instead, to head north, up to Scandinavia, to the cool Baltic coast, to Scotland, and up into the high mountains, all in search of milder temperatures, refreshing sea breezes, and considerably smaller crowds. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Ireland, and the Alpine regions, these once overlooked, quiet summer destinations are suddenly finding themselves genuinely and unexpectedly in demand. And it is not that the Mediterranean is being abandoned wholesale, it is rather that the entire calendar is quietly shifting. People are increasingly starting to visit the hot south during the cooler, gentler months of spring and autumn instead, and saving the cool north for the blazing peak of the summer. And that represents something genuinely, and rather profoundly significant. Climate change is very quietly beginning to redistribute economic opportunity right across an entire continent. The cool north stands to gain a whole valuable new tourist season that it never had before, while the traditional summer hotspots of the south now face mounting pressure to adapt and to reinvent themselves, or else risk slowly losing the very thing that draws the visitors in the first place. And it reaches far beyond just tourism too, because as the climate steadily warms, the very crops that farmers are able to grow, and even the specific regions in which fine wine can successfully be made, are all slowly but surely beginning to creep northward as well. The entire geography of European life is, quietly and steadily, on the move. And it is not only where people go that is changing, it is when they do things, and how they structure the very hours of the day. Across Europe, the deadly heat is quietly forcing a rewrite of daily life itself. Some countries have begun imposing outdoor work bans during the most dangerous hours of a heat wave, ordering construction sites and farm work to shut down through the blistering afternoons to protect laborers from collapsing in the sun. Schools are increasingly closing or shifting their hours earlier when the heat becomes too much for classrooms with no cooling. Sporting events and festivals are being rescheduled to the cooler edges of the day. In effect, the siesta, that old southern habit of surrendering the hottest hours and working in the cool of the morning and evening instead, is quietly spreading its logic across the whole continent as more and more of Europe is forced to bend its schedule around a sun that has simply become too fierce to ignore. The rhythm of the European day, unchanged for generations, is being slowly rewritten by the heat. So let me end, as I always try to, with genuine honesty and with real balance. First, the obvious point, just to be completely clear, Europe can, of course, still cool down. The seasons still turn, and winter most certainly still comes. The real story here is not some literally impossible one, but a subtler and a far more important truth, that Europe's summers are now crossing a genuine threshold, that the old, natural, effortless ways of staying cool are simply no longer enough on their own, and that a continent that was built over many centuries for a gentler and a cooler climate is now being forced to consciously, and often very expensively, adapt itself to something new. Second, and importantly, this is very far from being a story of pure helplessness. If anything, it is a story of an entire continent beginning, however slowly and however unevenly, to respond, rediscovering its own old wisdom, inventing clever new designs, planting trees, rewriting its building codes, and gradually reshaping both its cities and its habits for a hotter world. The tools that are needed to adapt genuinely do already exist. And third, that great air conditioning debate is a real and a completely legitimate one with no easy villain to point to. Because cooling truly does save lives, and it truly does carry real and serious costs, and the honest answer lies not in simply picking one side over the other, but in the difficult, careful, ongoing balance between the two. The real bottom line is this. The Europe that was so carefully built up over all those centuries, its shuttered stone houses, its dependable cool nights, its beloved southern summer holidays, and its comfortable old assumption that truly extreme heat was always going to be somebody else's problem, was designed from top to bottom for a world that is now quietly slipping away into memory. And the new heatwave reality is not, in the end, that Europe is somehow doomed to simply bake, helplessly, forever. It is that Europe, much like a great deal of the rest of the world, now has to learn how to live with a kind of heat that it was quite simply never built for in the first place, and it has to learn to do it wisely, and fairly, and fast. The continent is very far from being out of good options, But it is, quite unmistakably, now out of time to keep on pretending that nothing at all has really changed. So the very next time that you find yourself picturing a perfect European summer, the closed shutters of an old stone house, the empty, silent streets, and the heavy heat of the afternoon, the crowded beach lying beneath a blazing golden sun, I want you to understand that what you are really looking at is an entire way of life caught in the very middle of a quiet and a genuinely profound transformation. Those closed shutters were once entirely enough, all on their own, to keep the worst of the heat at bay. That deep afternoon stillness was once a gentle, pleasant rhythm of life, and not, as it is fast becoming, a desperate necessity. And that simple beach holiday was once an uncomplicated pleasure, rather than a slowly growing risk. All of it, every last piece of it, was quietly built around a climate that is now steadily fading into the past. Europe is most certainly not going to stop cooling down forever, but it is being forced, right now, in this very moment, to learn an entirely new way of keeping itself cool, one that its grandparents never once needed to know, and one that its grandchildren will simply grow up taking completely for granted. And just how well, and how wisely, and how fairly. The continent manages to learn that difficult lesson may very well end up shaping the whole of life across Europe for a very, very long time still to come.